identitarian virtue and virtue signaling itself and safetyism has now actually trumped and almost entirely undone the ability for logic and reason to challenge bad ideas.
Welcome to The Shape of Dialogue. Today I'm joined by cognitive psychologist Dr. Michael Johnston from the New Zealand Initiative and the Chief Executive of the Free Speech Union, Jonathan Ayling, to discuss the recent event on freedom of speech in universities hosted by Victoria University in Wellington. To listen to the event itself, there's a link in the show notes. And now I give you Michael Johnston and Jonathan Ayling. Welcome to The Shape of Dialogue. Today I'm joined by Michael Johnston and Jonathan Ayling. Jonathan's being beamed in, so welcome Jonathan and welcome Michael.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah. We're going to talk about a little bit about free speech today. Now Michael, do you want to set it up and tell us what happened at Victoria University, what was going to be set up and then what actually got
Yes,
done?
so the Vice-Chancellor, Nick Smith, a few months ago invited both Jonathan and me to appear on a panel, which was to be held in a public area of the university called the Hub. And the topic of discussion was what the university can do to support free speech, which I thought was a very good thing to talk about. Now, it's been fairly well publicised what happened, which was that a number of students and possibly other activists complained about right-wing voices being on the panel, by which they meant Jonathan and me. I'm not sure if either of us would actually use that label for ourselves, but that's what we were seen to be. And I have to say, Jonathan drew particular fire, probably a lot more than me. But as a result of those complaints, the Vice-Chancellor postponed the panel discussion, and when it re-emerged, it had split into two panels, with the first being supposedly community advocates, which included Jonathan and four activists, all with, shall we say, reservations about free speech. And the other was supposed to be an academic panel on which I was sitting with four other academics, again, all of whom I would say had some reservations about the merits of free speech, although two of them were a lot more rabid than the others. And so the event went ahead, and it was now in a lecture theatre where students wouldn't stumble across it by accident and be done irreparable harm, which was one of the issues raised, that students might hear it without wanting to, and that could be devastating. So ahead it went. My personal view is that it was a complete waste of time. I thought that the use of Corin Dan from RNZ, a reporter with RNZ, as the moderator worked especially poorly for the academic panel because he was incapable of delving into any of the actual issues regarding how the university could support free speech in the wider society. Instead, he focused narrowly on who should be allowed to speak on campuses and whether there was a free speech problem at universities themselves. So, predictably enough, everybody except Jonathan and me raised reservations about the potential for free speech to do harm. And as I say, I don't think that the discussion, particularly on the academic panel, touched on anything of great substance.
Right.
Yeah.
Can we just go back to the initial concept of the panel discussion? So it was just you and Jonathan and anyone else?
The initial panel, who else was supposed to be on that? It was Jane Kelsey and Nicole Moram and
John Byron.
And John Byron from Australia. Yeah, that's
right. And it was going to be set up in an open forum, and you're just going to basically dialogue amongst yourselves without a moderator.
That was my understanding. I don't think there was a moderator planned at that time.
Yeah. And maybe, Jonathan, do you want to talk about what some of the complaints were, particularly regarding the lack of so-called diversity?
Yeah. Let me go back a step,
Yeah,
Michael.
okay.
Even before where Dr. Johnston has started us off there. The context that this is occurring in, and I understand that some of your audience is based overseas, so it might be helpful for them to understand the political imperative that initiated this conversation. The coalition government that was elected in New Zealand about 6 months ago has within its coalition agreement a commitment to require universities to have a free speech policy. Without that, allegedly there will be sanctions on their funding now. And in New Zealand, all 8 of our universities are publicly funded. This has caused a bit of a furore among the administration of our higher education. The Vice Chancellor of Victoria University, who went on to sponsor this debate, wrote an article in the newspaper in our capital about concerns around this policy. And in his opinion, he said that this policy, a requirement for universities to have free speech policies, would actually end up seeing free speech silenced rather than defended. Now, I didn't exactly follow his argument in that regard, and actually then penned a response in the post myself as well. It was out of that exchange, I understand, that the vice chancellor then said, "Well, look, let's do a panel discussion on this." And so from the outset, I thought there was actually some quite good motivation behind the desire to host this discussion. I think there was a moderator still planned for that initial discussion. I think it was even Corin Dan at that point then. But it seemed to be, and this is getting to your question now, Michael, it seemed to be what I would consider a relatively balanced panel. There were a number of individuals who would approach this conversation from a different perspective, but have a genuine interest in what academic freedom and free speech means in these contexts. The question that was raised around diversity was one of these really reductive ones. And one of the things that I'm very insistent on is we call out the abuse and manipulation of language that is so prolific in our society at the moment. And the use of the word diversity is one of those. There were concerns raised around the so-called lack of diversity on this panel, concerns that reached kind of a fever pitch in many ways. There was quite wide national coverage of this issue over a series of about 10 days as the sequence of events unfolded that saw the event postponed and then recalibrated. What they meant by diversity, though, was minority groups, but particular individuals specifically from within minority groups who would voice the concerns that are currently emerging from what we might consider more extreme progressive perspectives and younger perspectives who have lost faith in the idea that individuals should be allowed to express provocative ideas.
Or perhaps never understood that in the first place, because who's educated them?
Well, Dr. Johnston, I think that's the critical point, actually. Right, I think you're absolutely right. Rather than lost faith of it, they have never understood the critical role free speech has played in founding the progressive, peaceful, stable, prosperous societies that we take for granted as liberal democracies. And so I think I want to call out the use of that word diversity. There was accusations, and as Dr. Johnston said there, he and I both drew a little bit of fire, me more than him at a slightly more personal level, and that largely came down to the fact that I lead an organization that, in my opinion, and I would say in the opinions of any even-handed commentator, acknowledges that we stand on a principle to defend individuals' speech rights. We have never stood by or defended any individual or any perspective. We have stood by individuals' speech rights, and that includes in defending the speech rights of some that we might call scallywags or scoundrels. And the particular individual here was Julian Batchelor. Whether he is either of those things, I'll let others decide. But certainly there is that.
Sorry, just when you say the particular individual here, you mean in the Free Speech Union has supported his free speech rights of this character.
The complaint was that the Free Speech Union had supported his speech rights, and many of the progressives would like to see him censored.
Yeah, well, they're conflating his speech rights with what he's saying. So it's not the Free Speech Union, and you correct me, Jonathan, Free Speech Union is not supporting what he's saying. They're supporting his right to say what he wants to say.
That's exactly right. And in fact, at a personal level, I have suggested that the contribution Julian Batchelor has made, who is an individual in New Zealand who has raised considerable concern around aspects of our race relations, I've suggested consistently that we're swimming in the shallow end of the swimming pool when we're dealing with his perspectives. But he should be free to make his contribution nonetheless. And Dr. Johnston, I'd be interested in kind of your comment on this as well. But from my perspective, since the event, which I totally agree was just an utter waste of time, since the event, we've heard, well, it's incorrect to characterize it as having had two commentators that were in favor of free speech and 8 commentators that were opposed to free speech. Everyone there, allegedly, was actually in favor of free speech. We just have different nuanced perspectives of what free speech means. And when the Dean of Auckland University of Technology's Law School, Professor Kylie Quince, gets up and says free speech is a colonialistic, imperialistic, Christian, capitalistic, patriarchal perspective, she is not a believer in free speech.
No.
We are putting such a burden on that term now that it means nothing. And if by free speech you mean people should be allowed to express opinions broadly that you agree with, then of course everyone has always been a defender of free speech. But that is such a nonsense, useless term at that point. Of course, the cliche is Hitler was in favor of free speech, Stalin was in favor of free speech, if you were saying things that they agreed with. That's not an interesting contribution to make. Free speech only has ever meant anything for opinions that you disagree with. And the more you disagree with it, the more interesting free speech becomes if you still stand by the right for individuals to express those perspectives. And it became abundantly clear throughout the evening that there was virtually no tolerance for opinions that others found distasteful or offensive, at which point they have no interest in free speech. And I think we cannot make that point clearly enough.
I completely agree. I mean, I'd probably cut some slack for Professors Nicole Moram and Richard Arnold, who
I agree.
I think they spoke in a perfectly reasonable and rational way. I may not agree with them about everything, but they're certainly people with whom I could engage productively. The rest of all the panelists on Jonathan's panel, except him and the other 2 on mine, I thought they're there to represent particular minority grievances, and they're unanimous that free speech causes more harm sometimes than doing good. And the irony, of course, is that, as Jonathan says, the word diversity, when it's used by these particular individuals, doesn't mean what you think it might mean. It means diversity of demographic characteristics such as race and sex or gender or whatever, or diversity of purportedly oppressed groups being represented. It doesn't mean diversity of viewpoint, which for those of us who cherish free speech is the most important thing, because in order to make progress in approaching truth, we need to contest ideas. And
if I can echo that, Dr. Johnston, I think that in this context, I'm not sure what value diversity of any other kind actually offers, except the value of diversity of perspective or viewpoint.
Well, again, the irony is that it leads to uniformity of viewpoint when you've got people who might represent different groups, but they've all got essentially the same grievance, which is that
I don't know if I accept that they. I don't know what justification there necessarily is that they do de facto represent.
Well, they don't. I mean, who credentials them to represent those groups is one question. That's true.
The fact that they are a particular skin color or they have a particular preference of others in bed means nothing to me on a panel of free speech. What is of value is the variance of perspectives, and I hesitate to use this term, but it has some value. The lived experiences of those individuals may mean that they then do take a different perspective, a different intellectual viewpoint on the subject. And at that point, there is value in that diversity. But there was very little different lived experience, allegedly, across at least the six, if we're excluding the two professors that sat on your panel that were somewhat more moderate. The six others were not diverse in the slightest. Despite the fact that they were different genders or different colors or had different sexual preferences, they were coming with the exact same drum to bang, and there's just not a context in which that represents diversity. I think that is worth mentioning.
Yeah.
It's ironic, the more diverse it is, and diverse in inverted commas, the less diverse it is.
That seems to be the way it goes.
Yeah. So, yeah, you go, Jonathan.
Another point that I think the diversity that you were asking about there, Michael, is one of the key aspects of what is so broken in our attempt to address some of these admittedly complex and fraught conversations. It's not that our interlocutors had nothing worth saying. That they did. Speech has power. I'm not a free speech advocate because I believe sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. On the contrary, I think words have incredible power, and that's why we must give incredible interest to individuals being able to use words and ideas to express themselves and to lead thought forward. So there has to be concern around the way certain minorities or individuals with certain backgrounds or certain lived experiences may interact with these ideas. But what that is used is as a sledgehammer to then crush any of the perspectives that they would characterize as far right or as fascistic or I don't know. There's a litany of epithets that they might lob at us.
Right wing. Possibly.
The interesting thing about that, which came up during the discussion but didn't really go anywhere, was another really important utility of free speech. So, Jonathan and I and other free speech advocates tend to talk about the noble properties of free speech. It helps us approach truth through the contestation of ideas in good faith. And it also allows crazy people to promulgate ideas that, if they caught hold, would be extremely dangerous. Now, the point about that, and this is the point that came up but didn't go anywhere, is that you want that to happen so that you can rebut them. If you censor them, that won't stop them thinking what they think. It won't stop them promulgating their ideas in a clandestine way to people who are disposed to hear them and take them on board and potentially act on them. So first of all, you want to know who these people are. You want them to be in plain sight. And you want their ideas to be out on the table so that they can be firmly contested. So the idea that censoring them is a wise idea.
Well, censoring them is actually just confining them to their own bubble.
That's
which
right.
is only going to reinforce.
That's right, precisely. Yeah. It's going to make them feel more alienated, they and their followers, more kind of martyred and exceptionalized.
And more, I mean, there's
more set in their views.
Yeah. I imagine a lot of these people are very much conspiracy orientated, and so that just reaffirms their, conspiracy theories.
That's right.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I accept that characterization, Michael. I would suggest some of the most dangerous ideas in our societies are the ones that unfortunately have taken hold.
I'm not disputing that. What I'm saying is that I'm arguing against the idea that people with crazy ideas or dangerous ideas should be censored.
I'll refer to you as Dr. Johnston just to avoid that.
I was going to say call me Michael, but we have too many Michaels around here.
I was referring to Goldwater's characterization of conspiratorial tendencies there. I know that fits the common narrative at the moment that there's the great common man who is noble and virtuous, and then there's kind of the fringe aspect of society that is a little bit more conspiratorial, and I guess we should probably tolerate them as well. I think actually some of the worst ideas in our society are actually some that we saw on display in this panel, and they have taken root. Unfortunately, as Dr. Johnston is referring to there, they have been picked up by a large number of people, and they particularly in our institutions like the university, and these are the ideas that we need to challenge, and that's exactly what was prohibited. It was verboten. It was not allowed to occur on this panel where we were I was flabbergasted. We were directly instructed that we could not engage or dialogue with anyone else on this panel discussion.
So you just to be clear, so you had to have go through the intermediary of Corin Dan.
It was a little bit different on each of the panels. So on Jonathan's panel, each member, it wasn't really a discussion in any way, shape or form. Each of them gave a short talk, and they were all disconnected. There was no dialogue whatsoever. There was some Q&A after each person from the moderator, but no actual dialogue.
So what's wrong
whatsoever.
with that? What's wrong with that?
Well, it means that you don't actually get to contest ideas because everybody just says something without any back and forth. You can't challenge what somebody else has said. You can't take on board what someone else has said and kind of say, well, okay, that's a good point, and maybe I got that wrong. There's none of that kind of valuable exchange at all, and so it's just a series of statements.
Right.
I could have very easily written each of the responses, and I think many people in the audience could have very easily written each of the responses that were provided by the various perspectives that were present on my panel. And as you say, Dr. Johnston, your panel was slightly different. There was a little bit more space for engagement, but
not much.
I mean, it
was all still controlled by the moderator.
Discussion.
It was still
exactly.
Every single question that we considered came from him, and so we couldn't take the discussion in any direction. We couldn't say go down a particular path that we found interesting. It was all, and that's why I think that it failed to grapple with what the Vice-Chancellor said he wanted the conversation to be about, which is the way that the university can support free speech. Again, instead it focused narrowly on campus issues like who should be allowed to speak and what the rules should be for speaking on campus.
And if I can go back to the point that I was making in terms of some of the dangerous ideas that have set root in our society, what we saw in the way that, at least the panel that I sat on, in the way that was run, was defense being run to ensure that these ideas are not challenged, that there is not a space to point out the error, and where we have some panelists going off about journalists whose heads are being chopped off overseas and ethnic cleansing occurring, and this is then why individuals talking about Mātauranga Māori in New Zealand shouldn't be allowed in universities. There is just a breakdown of any sense of a logical flow, and yet no one is allowed to point that out. No one is allowed to draw attention to that, and so unfortunately, I think it was lost at least on a number of the people who were there in the live audience. Because the rhetorical value of it is something that tickles their ears.
Yep.
They like to hear illustrations and comparisons made between journalists' heads being chopped off and Corin Dan being killed, and the fact that free speech actually maybe doesn't serve society very well. This is nonsense. It's unintelligent. It is a waste of time for those that were there listening.
Yes, I mean, the glaring flaw there, of course, is that the countries in which journalists' heads are in danger of being cut off are not notorious for their love of free speech.
And it is very much a product of the lack of an idea that individuals should be able to speak freely without facing violent retribution. And so the fact that they are making the very case that they are seeking to undermine, and yet no one can draw an illustration to that, means that in the very place where reason and intelligence and logic should be the primary currency, it is forbidden. And to me, that to me is deeply troubling, that in the university of all places, identitarian virtue and virtue signaling itself and safetyism has now actually trumped and almost entirely undone the ability for logic and reason to challenge bad ideas. And this, to me, and I know, Michael, you Johnston, you have come out of the university yourself, and I think this is an opinion that you may share as well. It does make me wonder whether these institutions are capable of reform at all.
Well, the thing that really struck me, I guess, for the more strongly than it has in the past, and it might be because I've now been out of the university for a couple of years and breathing much freer air, was how smug and self-congratulatory most of the academics were about the climate for free speech on campus. They seem utterly blind to the fact that people that don't agree with the kind of dominant worldview that they've adopted might feel as if they can't speak freely. It's something like, oh, we can voice all our opinions. I never feel censored. We're doing a great job here. And then kind of sticking their fingers in their ears if anybody says something that that grates against that worldview.
Well, just to put a little bit of context, I've mentioned this in other podcasts, so apologies if you're hearing it again. But recently I was at a talk, and after the talk, a woman approached me and said, she was a fan of the podcast, and she said, "Thank you for all you're doing." And I thought, what am I doing? I'm just having conversations. And she said, "Well, we can't have these conversations. We can't articulate these things." And I said, "What do you mean by we?" And she says, "Myself and all my university colleagues."
Yeah.
So that's a classic example of not being able to say the emperor has no clothes.
Yeah. Well, of course they can. Unlike some countries, they're not going to have their heads cut off if they do. And it frustrates me a little bit. I get it. People need to support their families. They fear for their jobs and so on, and that's understandable. But it's not as if they're being asked to die for the cause, And I get the same thing. Oh, you're so brave. No, I'm not brave. The brave people were the ones who fought 80 years ago on the beaches of Normandy to liberate Europe from actual totalitarianism. That was brave. So what we're being called to do is something much, much less than that. And especially if one is supposed to be a public intellectual, has a duty, a legislated duty to be a critic and conscience of society, and they won't take the risk with their employment. So again, I understand people have families and they need to support themselves, and I don't want to condemn individuals. But as a class, I think our academics have dropped the ball terribly. Yeah.
But nevertheless, there is that climate.
Yes.
And these academics have to work within that climate.
Yeah.
And
I take a slightly stronger tone on this, and Dr. Johnston, I think probably maybe you've shifted over some time in this regard as well. I understand that as I work alongside academics, they don't always appreciate this comment, but I do think actually academics deserve that context a little bit more than sometimes they're willing to admit, because
what do you mean by that?
Well, you know what, if you are in an environment where you refuse to speak up and you expect people to continue to respect your liberties, you will lose those liberties, and you have few others, no others, but few others to blame more than yourself. And I'm hesitant to jump straight to illustrations of fighting Nazis in the Second World War. But the reality is, if we don't stand up today, well, we didn't stand up yesterday, and today it's harder. And if we don't stand up today, tomorrow it will be harder. And these freedoms will continue to erode until, unfortunately, it will be incumbent on individuals to once again die for them. I don't think that's a salacious or inflammatory concept. Freedom is something that is perennially radical.
It requires maintenance. Democratic values require maintenance. And the reason for that is that the principle of free speech, and in fact broader principles of liberal democracy and human equality, are profoundly counterintuitive to a whole lot of inbuilt human psychological tendencies like my side bias and confirmation bias and all the rest of it. People get, history, of course, is replete with examples of this. And liberal societies, regrettably, have never lasted all that long, and they've always been the exception historically. But when you've grown up, and it's been a couple of generations since there's been any serious threat to the liberal democratic order, it's very easy to forget that. And that's why I think I come back to what we said at the start. A whole lot of the young people there have never had a proper education in what it means to be a citizen of a liberal democratic society. It's not just turning up to vote or deciding which politician you want to lead. It's actually taking part in the contest of ideas, vigorously defending the ground on which that contest can take place, and understanding how fragile and how precious it is and what we stand to lose if we don't defend it.
Yeah, liberalism has to be proactive.
Yes, it does.
Otherwise, the natural...
There's an entropy that will kick in.
Yes, the natural human forces are so strong against it that it has to be incredibly proactive. What does that say about the state of our universities? Are they doomed, or...?
I think they are. I think that and it's not just in New Zealand, it's elsewhere as well. I mean, in a very large country like America, you have some universities, some traditional and some new, that are making a special effort to defend the space as a venue for free discussion. I think of the University of Austin, which is a startup university, as it were. I think it's mostly online and it's attracting dissident academics, Niall Ferguson, Kathleen Stock, people like that. That's an interesting idea, and I wish it every success. And then you have some of the Ivy Leagues who have apparently had a change of heart. I'm sceptical. We'll see how that goes. But I think in a small country like New Zealand, there's so much of a monoculture. It's very hard to see how it can be repaired. So what's the answer? Time will tell. But I think higher education in the university sense, that is education for deep understanding of the disciplines of culture, like philosophy and mathematics and science, they'll need to be taken over by others in due course. And I just think that the culture of the university has already descended to such a diabolical level that pulling it back would be very hard, because the trouble is, once the culture of censoriousness is deeply rooted enough, it can't be fixed from within, because there's not enough people there who want to fix it or even recognize the problem. And those who do, and like myself, for example, find other things to do because one just gets tired of it, and actually,
well, the smart people go elsewhere.
Well, there's more opportunity to defend the values where I am now than there was when I was in the university. So
can I challenge that there, Dr. Johnston, slightly? Because Michael, I would take the question a step further than what you've said there. You're asking, are universities condemned? This conversation is within the context of free speech in the university. But I would suggest that Dr. Johnston there is saying that the universities are condemned. I would suggest the institutions at large of our democratic liberal society are condemned unless we do serious work quite quickly.
You're talking, you're including media, government.
So let me unpack that a little bit. This is quite a significant claim, but I think it is relatively easily substantiated. The foundations on which the prosperity and stability and peace of liberal democracies that we largely associate with the West, and we especially associate with the Anglosphere, are on the cusp of seriously unraveling. And this is across, I think there's largely 8 major institutions that the FSU seeks to work in. Of course, they include the universities, they include our court system, they include our political system, democratic representation, both local government and central government, public servants. They include our education system at primary and secondary, media, our religious entities, our cultural sector, arts, comics, writers, and the likes there. And I would say across each of these industries, these areas of professional contribution, there has been a fusion, and this steps away from free speech slightly, but I think free speech is an incredible victim of this. There's been a fusion of 2 incredibly destructive concepts, and unless we call out these concepts directly and challenge them, free speech will will die in our societies in many ways, but the idea of democracy, the idea of freedom, the idea of individualism, they are all at stake. The two ideas that we need to call out is this postmodern view that emerged through the Jean-François Lyotard's and the Jacques Derrida's and the Michel Foucault's, but has gone considerably beyond that as well, that challenges the existence of any kind of meta-narrative and underpinning that any sort of empirically demonstrable reality or truth. The postmodern challenge of any sort of reality of truth within our society is eroding at the very most basic levels the institutions that we have built in the West, and that is in the context of free speech. It takes a form. If there is no truth, what does free speech have to offer me? There's my truth, there's your truth, there's Dr. Johnston's truth. Your opinions, your reason, your logic mean nothing to my truth. So why does an exchange matter? Why does dialogue matter? All your opinions, all your perspective does is hurt me or offend me or make me feel uncomfortable.
Because it's all about power.
Does that offer me?
It's all about power, right? And so if it's all about power, then if I belong to a group that is perceived to have less power in society.
Well, no, hold on. That's the second point.
Right.
So that's the first point that we have to call out is the
assault on the idea that truth exists.
Truth exists, and that has been fused with exactly what you're referring to there, Dr. Johnston, which is the contribution of identitarian collectives, where groups and collectives take primacy over the individual. And what we can trace, and it is not true just for the West, it is not true just for in those countries that were touched through Enlightenment principles, but it is especially true for those contexts, was that societies turned their back on this belief that has dominated throughout human history, that the collective you're in, the group you're in, the tribe you're in, the gender you are, the color you are, this is what defines you. And orientated itself towards the individual, that we are each within ourselves the smallest form of a minority, because no human collection of beliefs and actions and background and lived experience has ever taken the form as it has in my life or in your life. And so individuals are the basis agent within society. And this has come out, and again, I don't have a philosophy in a PhD philosophy. Maybe I'll acquire one day. But as far as I can tell, and others can comment on this with a lot more specificity, what emerged again from Europe, but a little bit before the 60s and 70s, when we saw the postmodern contributions emerging, what we saw a little bit before, maybe in the 20s and 30s into the 40s, from the likes of the Institute of Critical Studies based in Frankfurt, this neo-Marxist perspective that said actually the Marxist worldview should not orientate only towards the economic drivers within a society, but attach itself to the cultural structures within society. And once that has occurred, it takes a few generations for that to unravel. But it embeds itself more and more. And critical within that is that we are not individuals. We should not be given freedom as agents within ourselves. We exist with any value only within collective groups. And so this is the identitarianism that is rabid in our societies nowadays, coupled and collated with the challenge that any truth exists.
Yeah.
And as these two are fused together, our Western liberal societies cannot continue to exist, and our institutions will not continue to exist while these ideas are defended.
It's a good description of what's happened, and I might add that I think the postmodern idea on its own, I think it was largely, well, I think it's wrong. I think there is an objective reality, and I think processes like science and free speech allow us to approach it. But it wasn't that harmful on its own. Where it became harmful was where it fused with this identitarian view and this idea that power is a zero-sum game, and that if some group has an historical grievance, then that gives them a special status now to have what they see as redress, which means that their point of view is privileged and other points of view can be censored, and that people can be punished in various ways for criticizing them and so on. And I agree that Jonathan's characterization of where we're headed, it's not hyperbolic to say that this ultimately leads to physical violence and and deep conflict, because that is the natural state of human beings. Unfortunately, that's the way in which most societies throughout history have conducted themselves. And it is a very rare period in history in which we sit, where, notwithstanding certain conflicts that are ongoing in the world at the moment, and the fact that we've never been free of war, we've lived through the most peaceful century in human history.
Yeah, and also the least violent within those societies.
Right. That's right. Violent crime
and the most prosperous.
Certainly the most prosperous, and the fastest innovation of technologies and so on. I mean, the list goes on. The lowest levels of poverty.
My question is when is the best time to be the poorest person in the world?
Yeah, right. I mean,
and it's probably now.
I mean, being the poorest person in the world is never any fun, but the proportion of the world's population that lives in absolute poverty is far, far, far lower now, even than it was 30 years ago.
Well, it's actually flipped. About 1900, it was 90% of the world lived in abject poverty. Now it's 10%.
Yeah.
So it's extreme.
And it remains on a
in
downward trajectory. And, I believe we can draw a line between liberal democratic values, especially free speech, and that prosperity. Why? Because, well, not least because it makes science possible. It makes it possible for scientists to discuss their ideas without fear that some priesthood is going to come along and imprison them or kill them.
Yeah.
And having had 200 years of that culture, look at what's happened. We've had from the theory of evolution to Einstein to the invention of the internet and space travel, and it just.
I mean, look at what we're doing here. We've got.
Yeah.
He's
right.
He's 50 miles away.
Phenomenal.
Yeah. Hey.
And by science, Dr. Johnston, what you mean there, of course, is not simply biology or chemistry, but the development of knowledge.
The apparatus of science, in terms of its dialogic structure, the way in which we bring evidence to bear on questions, we test those questions with that evidence, and we freely contest the meaning of that evidence. In order to develop our ideas, in recognition that we're never perfectly right, but there is a truth out there to which we are tending towards through that process.
And the reason I raise that is I think that's a perfect summary there. And to draw this all the way back around to the genesis of this conversation, that was exactly what was prohibited, I believe.
Yeah, it was.
I mean, a conversation, you can't call it a debate, certainly not. You can't call it a discussion. You can't call it a panel. I don't even think you can call it a conversation.
It was a series of short interviews.
It was a series of monologues, really. I mean, many of the panelists refused outright to answer the questions of the interviewer, and so.
I have to plead guilty on that one myself, and the reason for that is that he wasn't sticking to the brief.
And that's right. Yeah. What I find interesting, though, Dr. Johnston, in that kind of that broad sense of science that we're referring to there, it is. Those within science, in the narrow sense of that definition, what we might consider more along the lines of the hard sciences, that I think are, if there is hope within our universities at the moment that we can turn this around, it will have to emerge from there, because they have been relatively impervious to this fusion of these two toxic and pernicious ideas.
A few years ago, I was more optimistic about that than I am now. I think, first of all, the scientists didn't really see it coming. They saw some ructions going on in the humanities faculties and thought they were crazy and just kind of left them alone, as if it wouldn't come for them. But of course it has, and there's all sorts of questions on which science has a bearing which you can't talk about, the most salient of which might be, the nature of biological sex and its relationship to gender expression and so on. That's a minefield that only extremely brave intellectuals would care to tread in. So, and you see what happens to the likes of Kathleen Stock when they do.
Which is unbelievably ironic, because it's sort of almost the most obvious thing about biology. Obviously true.
Well, it's Yes.
Yeah.
Of course.
We need to wrap this up. I just want to ask Jonathan a question. Because you were talking about the decay of institutions. My last podcast was with the renowned journalist Jonathan Rauch, who the Free Speech Union brought out to New Zealand. And his thesis in The Constitution of Knowledge is that knowledge is created through networks of institutions. Now, I'm 100% in agreement with him, with regard to institutions such as the media and universities, etc. But the real question is, what happens when those institutions are corrupted? You've touched on that.
They become agents of the very thing they were established to oppose. And I think that is just blatantly clear that across the 8 industries that I referred to earlier, we continue. The FSU continues to do considerable work, and Alex de Tocqueville said, I think his number was 200 years, that democracies can only exist for 200 years. After that, the institutions within them become corrupted, and while democracy in name might continue, it becomes perverted. It's quite an incredible claim, and I think perhaps it's too much to say in New Zealand. It's not to say that democracy has died entirely, though I would point out we're not quite at 200 years. And by the time we get another 15 years down the road, I actually haven't thought that before doing the math, but actually his number may be bang on. I would suggest that these institutions become perverted and not so much cease to exist, but morph into something that is
what actually the way I'd put it. First of all of these institutions are underpinned by human values because they're human institutions. They have to be. Now, the liberal democratic institutions grew over a period of centuries. I think the best example is England. So you can go back as far as the Magna Carta to see the beginnings of it. But what I find really interesting about English history is how the institutions evolved quite gradually, which rooted them in very deep soil. You had the phenomenon of the common law, for example. You had challenges to the power of the monarch successively over many centuries. There was a civil war which resulted in the deposing of the monarch for about 10 years. But what is striking to me about England is the way that liberal democracy emerged and full democracy eventually in the early 20th century with a minimum of bloodshed and very, very strong concepts of the contest of ideas built into its institutions, like Parliament, where you have a government and an opposition who argue with one another, where you have an adversarial legal system where a prosecution and defence argue with one another. And there was a kind of implicit understanding that this is the way that you developed better ideas. But as Jonathan said, whether it's 200 years or some other number, at some point the values get forgotten for precisely the reason that people take them for granted, because they are the beneficiaries for them for so long that they can't imagine things being any different.
Well, they just don't know that they didn't take them for granted necessarily. They just don't know they're there.
Or even that. That's right. Well, I think that is kind of anyway. And so
that is why, and speaking from my personal perspective more than, that is why it is crucial that beyond political structures or broader cultural structures, the societal aspects that we have, there needs to be a moral structure that seeks to reinforce and remind consistently every individual of the reality of the human condition. And I would suggest, without going into that, I think that's an entire different podcast, Michael, but I would suggest that the West has, and Dr. Johnston, you referred to England especially, has abandoned the structures that we have previously held to that played a role in consistently reminding every individual of the human condition.
That's right.
That is inescapable for us.
See, things like...
As we have done that, we have paid the price for it.
Yeah, I mean, things like government, right? In a liberal democracy, we cede them power with a certain understanding that they use that power to ensure equality of access to institutions, and especially voting and decision making. And yes, that's always imperfect, and we can always work to make it better. But the thing is that when the values that underpin democracy start to erode, those institutions still have the power, but they no longer have the values that guide them in the right direction. So I agree with Jonathan entirely that we need to have almost an explicit moral framework. And, the Americans tried that with their constitution. I'm not sure that in the end anything defends us against this decay except, what we're doing now. And this is a very small thing that we're doing. We're having some conversations, but I think we have to have some humility about that too. And the thing is that it does catch on, and maybe there is hope, because if enough people do this and they keep doing this, then maybe we get somewhere, and maybe we win, and maybe we don't. Maybe it all goes down in flames, but at least we tried.
Well,
in my late 20s, I'm entirely too young to resign myself to the absence of hope within society.
I'll never relinquish it. I'm much older than you, but in the end, it's worth spending one's life defending.
Well, not least because if we are to have any hope of having impact, we have to have a compelling, hopeful vision. Yep. And if I can quickly note just an illustration of this that occurred to me at the end of last year, the Free Speech Union was hosting Lord Jonathan Sumpton here in New Zealand, and we had Sir Bill English on a panel with him. And the juxtaposition between those two, who agreed on many issues, but Lord Sumpton, a perennially pessimistic commentator, and Sir Bill, the contrast, ever hopeful that the future can be brighter. At the very least, any hope of us building a movement has to be built around the fact that we can imagine tomorrow being better.
Agreed.
Well, I always think strategically optimism is a better strategy than pessimism.
Quite right.
So just really briefly, Jonathan, what can individuals in New Zealand do about the situation?
Well, one of the most pivotal things that I stand to contribute is suggesting that you join the Free Speech Union. That is slightly self-interested. But if it's not the Free Speech Union, something of a similar kind, where you put some skin in the game, preferably some finances as well, quite seriously, and you actually become part of a movement pushing back. Reject the idea that there is no reality and that you are the sole source of what is true in your life. Reject the idea that you are defined by your class or your race or your sexuality or your gender or any litany of identifying characteristics. They have value, but you as an individual are the fullest expression and the only expression of what is relevant there and the basic agent of society. Just listening to Dr. Johnston in his previous comment there, I think Ayling Ali has some really interesting comments to be making in this space at the moment, and contributions like those that she are making continue to give me hope that there are people that are still awake to this. And Michael, this is perhaps a longer response than you were looking for here, but what I would suggest is a reminder that we do not need a majority of people to buy into these values to have the impact. I reject that
exactly.
Social change
I completely agree.
requires a majority.
Yeah.
I again, other
and
scholars...
that's why the postmodernists have done so well, because they're only a tiny minority.
And over to, this is crude, but largely we can break society down into those who do culture and those who have culture done to them. And I would suggest that scholars, maybe it's an 8%, maybe 10%, somewhere around there. If we can build a movement of people that are strategic and sacrificial and dedicated and connected as a community to push for these values, no matter what the values are, they will likely have considerable impact within a society. And so what does 10% look like in New Zealand? It's about 500,000 people. I'm very hopeful that the Free Speech Union has over 20% of that already. Who's contributing the next 20%? Let's continue to build a movement of people that reject this nonsense and that return to the basic liberal foundations that have given us the incredible country that we've inherited.
Well, that is a beautiful place to stop. Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you, Michael.
Thank you very much.
Cheers.
To help the Shape of Dialogue grow, please subscribe, like and comment and share it to all and sundry. Many thanks.